Denzel Washington silences Kash Patel in a viral House hearing showdown. During a heated House oversight hearing, something unprecedented happened. Former actor and public advocate Denzel Washington, appearing voluntarily to testify on government accountability, was unexpectedly insulted by Kash Patel, a former Trump advisor turned political operative. What unfolded next would silence the entire room, and soon the nation. It was supposed to be routine. Lawmakers filed in, journalists lined the walls, cameras rolled, but something about the air felt thick, like the moments before a storm. Denzel Washington sat at the witness table, calm, steady. He wasn't under investigation. He wasn't defending himself. He was there to speak on behalf of neglected communities and to support proposed legislation targeting systemic corruption. Across from him, Kash Patel leaned forward, smirking, calculating. Then, without warning, he said into the microphone, "With all due respect, Mr. Washington, you don't belong here. You're nothing but a thug in a suit." Gasps. Audible shock rippled through the chamber. Staffers froze. Cameras zoomed in. The insult hung in the air like a toxin. But Denzel didn't blink. He stared at Patel, not with fury, but with the stillness that unsettled the room. Then, after 5 long seconds of silence, he leaned forward and spoke. His voice was calm, his words devastating. "Sir, I've walked through neighborhoods forgotten by the system. I've sat with mothers who buried their sons and couldn't afford a proper funeral. I've raised a family in places where hope was a luxury. And you call me a thug?" He paused, letting the room feel the weight. "You, who've never been elected to anything, yet maneuvered through back doors of government, enriching yourself while communities collapsed. You who redirected federal money to organizations connected to your own consulting network, while veterans slept on the streets." Kash shifted uneasily. The murmurs began. "No, sir," Denzel continued, voice steady. "You don't get to call me a thug, not while your paper trail reeks of grift and your public service has served only one interest, your own." Patel tried to interrupt, but the chairman intervened. "Let him speak." Denzel then opened a manila folder on the table. "This report, buried in committee records for 3 years, details over $12 million in grants funneled into shell nonprofits tied to your business partners. One of them held exactly 3 events over 4 years. Another bought luxury office space in Georgetown while claiming to serve the unemployed." Another folder opened. More documents. Patel's expression darkened. "COVID relief funds meant for Black-owned businesses in South Central LA, rerouted after a phone call from your office to a lobbying group you once served as counsel for. That's not just mismanagement, that's theft of survival." Gasps again. A young woman in the second row began to cry. She had testified before Patel's advisory board once. No one followed up. Denzel continued, quieter now, more personal. "You want to talk about thugs? Thugs don't just operate in alleys. They wear ties. They sit behind desks. They hide behind procedure and exploit the people they claim to defend." Kash Patel said nothing. The calm in the room was surgical. Then Denzel whispered, "This isn't personal, it's painful. I grew up with nothing. I know what it means to feel invisible. But when someone rises into power and uses that platform to feed themselves instead of the people, they need to be seen for who they are." He turned toward the gallery, eyes locking with a teenage girl in the back. "This isn't about Washington. This is about Tamika, 11 years old, who wrote to this government for help for her grandma." No reply, just silence, just mold, just hunger. The girl nodded tearfully. Outside the hearing room, the moment went viral. TikTok, YouTube, X, Instagram. "Did you see what Denzel just did to Kash Patel?" people asked. He spoke like it was a sermon. Cable news scrambled. CNN called it the moral showdown of the year. Fox News said he brought receipts, not rage. Back in the room, Denzel remained composed. He placed another folder on the desk. This one shows how housing repair funds vanished, while Patel's allies bought new property on the same blocks left crumbling. This isn't oversight. This is betrayal dressed in legalese. Kash Patel remained silent, his face paled. His team shifted in their seats. Denzel closed the folder softly. "I didn't come here for vengeance. I came here because people like Tamika still believe someone in this room gives a damn. And I couldn't let her believe that someone was you. As Denzel Washington looked around the chamber, his voice grew heavier, yet more intimate. When I see that the same pain still lingers in the neighborhoods you claim to represent, Mr. Patel, I have to ask, what exactly have you been doing for the past 15 years? Kash Patel blinked rapidly. His lips tensed into a thin, hard line. Denzel reached into his folder and pulled out a folded, handwritten letter. This is from an 11-year-old girl named Tamika. She wrote to your office twice, begging for help to get her grandmother out of a building with its roaches, no hot water, and stairs her grandmother can no longer climb. That was 2 years ago. A murmur swept through the room as Denzel opened the letter and began to read it aloud. His voice didn't shake, it resonated. Dear government people, my grandma keeps coughing at night. We got bugs in the walls. I try to clean, but I can't do everything. Can you help us? Please don't forget us. By the end, half the room was wiping their eyes. This, Denzel said quietly, is why I came today, for Tamika. Patel shifted forward, trying to regain control. His voice cracked slightly. Mr. Washington, this is political theater. You're exploiting children to score points. But Denzel didn't flinch. He calmly raised a photo, one that showed Kash Patel smiling beside a gold-embossed ribbon at the grand opening of a luxury apartment complex. You stood here and praised affordable housing, Denzel said coldly. But what no one said was that 70% of those units went to out-of-state investors. Not your district, not Tamika, not her grandmother. The projector behind him flickered on. Documents, emails, wire transfers, company names, all tied to shell corporations connected to Patel's inner circle. A staffer behind Patel dropped a folder and hurried out of the room. You didn't just fail your community, Denzel continued. You used them. You stood on their pain and built a throne of illusion and influence. Even lawmakers from Patel's own political camp began averting their eyes. The hearing no longer felt like oversight. It felt like Judgment Day. Denzel paused and took a breath. His voice softened. I don't enjoy this. This isn't vengeance. It's reckoning. He turned toward the chairman. I request permission to enter into the record signed testimonies from former staffers who resigned from Mr. Patel's office due to ethical violations. Approved, the chairman said. Denzel opened one affidavit. I was ordered to falsify expense reports and to redirect community calls to a voicemail that was never checked. Kash Patel sat slumped in his seat now. His voice was gone, his face hollow, his power evaporating. Denzel turned back toward the gallery, his voice resolute. If this is what representation looks like, then the people of this country deserve better. Our democracy deserves better. Then, breaking every expectation, Denzel looked directly at Patel and said, I forgive you. Gasps echoed. Silence followed. It wasn't weakness. It was power, the kind that disarms rather than destroys. Because this isn't about hate. It's about healing. And healing starts when truth walks in and lies walk out. A soft applause broke out, not from partisans, but from people. The cameras kept rolling. The nation was watching, and across the country, in community centers, living rooms, barbershops, schools, the ripple was already spreading. In South LA, a group of elderly Black residents watched the hearing streamed on a borrowed laptop. When Denzel read Tamika's letter again, 87-year-old Miss Geraldine clutched her chest and whispered, That little girl lives down the hall from me. She wasn't lying. Another woman stood up, eyes red with rage. Kash's office never once returned my calls. He's been using us for years. Back in the chamber, Patel still hadn't spoken. His aides whispered nervously. His legal team looked on edge. No one dared interrupt anymore. Denzel stepped forward again. This is bigger than party lines, he said. This is about pain, real, generational pain. And today, it finally has a voice. He looked at the room, then gently set aside his notes. Let me tell you something you won't find in any folder. He stood taller. I'm not a polished man. I didn't go to Georgetown. I didn't inherit networks. I shoveled mud. I cleaned floors. I've buried friends. I've sat in funeral homes with no air conditioning and cried over boys taken too soon. The room was stone still. So when someone like you, Mr. Patel, calls someone like me a thug, I know what you mean. You don't mean criminal. You mean poor. You mean working class. You mean unwelcome. A junior congressman lowered his head. A woman on the panel snapped her pen in two. But I stand here today, still standing, not because I had privilege, not because I had protection, but because I kept showing up when the world told me I didn't belong. Tears now came, not from Denzel, but from the audience. So no, Mr. Patel, I'm not a thug. I'm every man you forgot. Kash Patel reached for his mic, his hand visibly shaking. But before he could speak, Denzel calmly raised a hand. No more words, sir, just one question. He leaned forward. When was the last time you walked your district without cameras? Silence. When was the last time you sat beside a grieving mother without handing her a press release? No answer, just the pounding sound of guilt. Denzel walked forward and placed a photo in front of Patel. It was from 5 years ago, a candlelight vigil for a boy named Deshaun, shot in a drive-by. Patel had promised reforms. Nothing ever came. You forgot him, but his mother didn't forget you. Cameras clicked. Kash Patel sat frozen, silent, for the first time ashamed. Across America, screens glowed. The clip replayed 1,000 times, and something deeper than outrage began to rise. Truth. As the chairman called for a brief recess, the hallway outside erupted with whispers, camera crews, and stunned aides. Did Denzel just dismantle his entire career without raising his voice? Someone whispered. Even Patel's critics weren't cheering. They were quiet, not out of fear, out of respect. Inside a break room, 2 former Patel staffers sat wordless. One finally spoke. Everything he said, we saw it happen. Back in the chamber, Denzel sat alone at the table, flipping through letters from families in Compton and Watts. His hands trembled, not from nerves, but from carrying what they had shared with him. The recess ended. Everyone returned. Kash Patel walked in slower now. His eyes didn't scan the crowd. They stared at the floor. The chairman gave Denzel the floor one final time. He rose. I know many came today expecting politics as usual, a debate. He looked around. But this isn't politics. This is a reckoning. This is not a debate, Denzel said, turning toward Pashus again. This is a reckoning. He raised one final piece of paper, worn at the edges, stained with years of neglect. This document shows over $4 million in housing repair funds missing from projects in Englewood and Watts. Meanwhile, families lived in units filled with black mold, leaking pipes, collapsed ceilings. This isn't speculation. This came from a whistleblower. He held the document higher. Your whistleblower, Mr. Patel, someone who used to believe in you. A gasp shot through the gallery. A man in the audience stood involuntarily. It was the contractor who had once been hired to fix those homes and then cut out of the deal. Kash Patel began to tremble. His hands gripped the table's edge. The hearing room no longer felt like Congress. It felt like a memorial for a career collapsing in real time. Patel stood, his voice trembling. This is a personal attack, he said shakily. You're trying to destroy a man of color and power. But Denzel only shook his head, calmly like a teacher correcting a student. No, sir, this isn't about tearing you down. This is about restoring dignity to the people you were entrusted to protect. Being brown didn't make you corrupt. Power did, and power without humility destroys everything it touches. Gasps again. A senator nearby lowered his head. Another closed her notebook, visibly shaken. If this were about race, Denzel said firmly, I wouldn't be here. This is about truth, and truth doesn't care about your resume or your connections. Patel's eyes watered, but he turned away. He had no answer. Denzel reached into his folder and placed a single envelope on Patel's desk. This is from Tamika. You never answered her letters. Maybe now, you'll listen. The room went quiet, heavy, sacred. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred, a nation holding its breath. Kash Patel slowly sank back into his chair. The fire in his posture was gone. What remained was a hollowed silhouette of regret. Denzel turned back toward the audience. "This isn't vengeance," he said gently. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm here because the people who once believed in you still deserve answers." He looked to the third row. "There's a woman here today. Her name is Mrs. Claudine Harris. She's 72. Her ceiling caved in last winter. She called her representative's office 7 times. No one ever called her back." Gasps again. Cameras turned. An elderly woman in a lavender shawl dabbed her eyes. "She flew here on a borrowed ticket," Denzel added, "just to be seen." His voice trembled slightly, but only from the weight of his mission. "She's not asking for riches, she's asking for safety, for dignity, for what she was promised." Patel wouldn't look up, but everyone else did, because the story was no longer just political. It was personal. It was truth. Denzel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black notebook, frayed at the edges. These aren't legal arguments. They're not opposition research. They're letters, voicemails, cries. He held the notebook high. "People trusted you, Mr. Patel. They believed in your words, and in return, they got silence, mold, broken promises." Patel looked up, his face expressionless. Blank, empty. "Say something," a reporter whispered under their breath. But he didn't, and in that silence, everything was said. One by one, members of the audience began to cry. A mother held her child tighter. A young man stood and clapped, once, then again. And soon the entire gallery rose in quiet, emotional applause. Denzel didn't smile. He just nodded and whispered under his breath, "They matter. Not me. Them." For years, Patel had controlled the narrative, but in one morning, Denzel Washington had handed it back to the people. The chairman checked the time. "Mr. Washington, you have made your point. This hearing is nearing its close." Denzel nodded, then he turned to Kash Patel for the final time. "I didn't come here to end your career, sir. That was your choice. I just turned on the light." Patel's face cracked. He blinked rapidly, then lowered his head. The room went silent again. But it wasn't silence filled with fear. It was the silence of something ending. As Denzel walked out of the hearing room, reporters didn't shout. They didn't chase. They stood still, silent, watching. Outside, Mrs. Claudine Harris reached for his hand. "God sent you," she whispered. And just like that, Denzel Washington, once dismissed as just an actor, now walked into history. Not with rage, not with power, but with truth. His footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. No entourage, no performance, just gravity. Inside a nearby room, a group of congressional interns huddled around a laptop watching the feed. "I thought he was just another voice," one said quietly. "But today, he became something else." "He didn't defend himself with pride," another whispered. "He defended the people with pain." Meanwhile, clips of his testimony flooded the internet. Not just Twitter and TikTok, but churches, school hallways, living rooms. Black pastors in Georgia, single mothers in Detroit, veterans in Kentucky, they all said the same thing. "He spoke for us." And somewhere in a coal town in Ohio, an old man sat back and whispered, "That man understands." In just one morning, a word meant to shame him, thug, had been rewritten. Not with anger, with truth. At CNN headquarters, editors scrambled. Producers stood in silence. 12 million views in under 2 hours, someone gasped. A veteran anchor stared at the screen and said, "We've never seen a hearing like this." Fox News ran the headline, "Denzel Washington exposes 3 decades of silence with 1 day of truth." Even commentators who normally criticize him stood still. On The View, a liberal host wiped tears from her eyes. "I don't agree with him on policy, but today, he wasn't a celebrity. He was a voice for the broken." Meanwhile, outside the building, Denzel quietly greeted a small group of citizens. Among them, Tamika, holding a crumpled photo of her grandma. Denzel knelt down, hugged her gently. "You matter," he whispered, "and I hear you." That photo hit the internet. It went viral within minutes. Inside Kash Patel's office, silence. Ringing phones, staff gone, doors closed. The damage was done. That night, in homes across the country, families who never watched C-SPAN sat around phones and TVs, watching again, not for politics, but for truth. In Alabama, an old man turned to his grandson. That boy ain't no thug. He's a fighter. Not with fists, but with fire. Not with fists, but with fire. In a small church in Baltimore, a pastor paused mid-sermon and recited the words that now echoed across the nation. Power without humility destroys everything it touches. Meanwhile, inside his Capitol office, Kash Patel sat in darkness. The lights were off, the curtains drawn. His decades of influence were crumbling, not under scandal, but under a truth too powerful to spin. But Denzel Washington, he didn't go to a celebration. No press conference, no media tour. He returned to his room, quietly opened his Bible, and sat in silence. Because this moment wasn't about victory, it was about awakening. And America had finally opened its eyes. Before leaving the Capitol that evening, Denzel returned to the now empty hearing chamber. The air was still, solemn. He approached Kash Patel's empty seat and gently placed an envelope on the microphone. It wasn't a legal document, it was a letter, handwritten during the recess. A letter to a man who once held the trust of his people. You could have been a light, it read, a giant, but you chose comfort over sacrifice, position over purpose. It's not too late to tell the truth. Outside the chamber, a young staffer caught sight of Denzel leaving the letter. He didn't say a word, he just nodded, eyes wide with reverence. As Denzel exited the building, cameras flashed, but his face showed no pride, only quiet exhaustion. The weight of what had happened still heavy on his shoulders. The country had seen the truth. Now it had to decide what to do with it. The next morning, headlines covered every screen. The moment that shook D.C. Denzel shames Patel with truth, ends it with forgiveness. Thug or hero, America decides. But something else was happening. In Compton, Watts, and Englewood, people weren't marching in anger. They were gathering in churches, in gyms, in community centers. For the first time in years, they weren't just mad. They were awake. At a town hall in South LA, a mother stood up holding her phone. She played the audio of Denzel's speech from the hearing. He didn't shout, he didn't curse. He spoke, and I felt every word, she cried. Back in DC, Patel's office remained silent. No statement, no apology, just ringing phones no one answered. Meanwhile, Denzel sat in his office, not reading news coverage, but letters, hundreds of them. Stories, pain, confessions. He read every one. It was no longer about a political win, it had become a cultural reckoning. In classrooms, teachers quoted him. On podcasts, his words were dissected. On TikTok and Twitter, teens stitched his testimony into hope. Power without humility destroys everything it touches. In a high school history class in Oakland, a teacher played Denzel's 5-minute closing statement. When it ended, a student in the back wiped his eyes and whispered, "I wish my father could have heard that." Even President Trump, in a rare moment of restraint, issued a brief statement. What Mr. Washington did yesterday wasn't political. It was presidential. That evening, Kash Patel finally emerged. He stepped in front of a dozen cameras, eyes lowered, voice soft. No comment at this time. But as he turned to walk away, a reporter held up Denzel's letter. For just a second, Patel paused, then lowered his head. The damage was done, but something deeper had begun. Truth had entered the room, and it refused to leave. In Patel's LA district office, the curtains stayed shut. His staff had stopped responding. The phones kept ringing. Down the block, community activist Tyrone Fields stood outside with a stack of housing repair requests. "I begged that office for help," he told reporters. "Miss Ruth died under a moldy roof, cold winter. No heat, no call back." The grief on his face went viral instantly. Back in Washington, Denzel sat alone, holding a child's crayon drawing with 3 words. "Thank you, Denzel." He smiled faintly, because this wasn't about him. It never was. That night in South LA, an emergency town hall filled beyond capacity. Over 300 people crammed into a space built for 100. At the front stood Sister Helen, a 65-year-old woman who once campaigned for Kash Patel in the early 2000s. She held a photo of her son. "He was killed in gang crossfire. I begged for help to clean up our street. They said they'd handle it. That was 19 years ago." Tears filled the room, not from politics, but from truth. Then someone played a clip. You chose comfort over sacrifice, position over purpose. The crowd wept, not in anger, in release. Meanwhile, Kash Patel's mansion sat guarded, but inside, no answers. The very streets that once raised him now rose up, not with pitchforks, but with stories. They weren't angry that he fell. They were angry that he stopped caring. Back on Capitol Hill, a sealed envelope arrived at the Oversight Committee. Inside, foreign wire transfers, fake shell companies, and a voice recording. Don't worry, the voters, they'll vote for him no matter what. Just keep them distracted. The networks confirmed the audio. It aired across the nation. America didn't gasp, it groaned. That afternoon, Denzel returned to the chamber. He stood silently, staring at the chair where Patel had once called him a thug. I was called that name, he said, but I've never stolen a dollar. Never made a promise I didn't keep. I may not have his years, but I have the people's tears. He paused, and I will not waste them. The room stood, slowly, solemnly. Denzel hadn't just changed the narrative. He had closed the chapter. Then something unexpected happened. A Democratic representative, Maria Soto, stood from her seat. I didn't come here to praise Denzel Washington, but what he did in that chair, it wasn't politics, it was truth. And as a public servant, I have to admit, I forgot what that felt like. Silence, then quiet clapping, then standing ovation. But Denzel didn't smile. He just folded his hands and whispered to no one in particular, this wasn't about me, it was about the forgotten, and now they've been heard. Within 24 hours, murals began to appear across Watts and Compton. Not of Denzel's face, but of his words. You may hold power, but we carry pain, and pain always outlasts politics. And in the hearts of those once ignored, something lit again. Not rage, but remembrance. And maybe, finally, redemption. It was about pain, Representative Maria Soto said softly, her voice breaking. And as a public servant, I must admit, I've forgotten that pain myself. Her words echoed across the chamber, across party lines, across decades of cynicism. Reporters scrambled. Viewers at home leaned forward. For a moment, partisanship dissolved. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice barely held together. I never thought I'd say this, he murmured, but today, we didn't witness a political win. We witnessed a moral one. Denzel Washington stepped back, hands folded, eyes lowered. He had said everything he came to say. And as he turned to leave, it began, slowly, softly, a single clap, then another. Then the entire House chamber stood, not in spectacle, but in quiet reverence. Denzel didn't smile. He simply nodded. Not for applause, but for the people behind every word he had spoken. And for the first time in decades, the House chamber felt cleansed. Within 24 hours, murals began appearing across Denzel Washington's hometown. Not of his face, but of his words. You may hold power, but we carry pain, and pain will always outlast politics. In South LA, teenagers painted the quote across the side of a neglected community center, the same center Kash Patel once promised to rebuild. Meanwhile, quiet investigations began into the documents Denzel had submitted. Former aides began speaking, and one brave voice, Patel's own former chief of staff, went on national television and confirmed the worst. We stopped serving the people a long time ago. No one had the guts to say it until Denzel did. Social media overflowed. From Mississippi to New York, people who had once felt invisible now felt seen. Denzel hadn't saved them, but he had acknowledged them. And in doing so, he had done what most leaders forget. He made ordinary Americans feel human again. That night, Denzel Washington sat alone in his office. A single desk lamp glowed above stacks of handwritten letters, each one from someone who had cried while watching the hearing. One final envelope arrived. No return address, just a folded note. I don't expect forgiveness, but I understand now. I'm sorry. Signed only, KP. Denzel didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes, not in victory, but in peace. Later that evening, he made a brief statement to the press. I didn't come to Washington to win arguments. I came to tell the truth. And if that truth brought healing, even to one child, one elder, one broken family, then it was worth it. He looked directly into the cameras, into America, and left the nation with one final message. I was called a thug, but I responded as a man. And sometimes that's the greatest power of all. Dear viewers, if this story moved you, if it made you cry or gave you hope or reminded you that truth still matters, please don't leave quietly. Like this video to honor the forgotten. Comment with the name of someone who still deserves justice. Subscribe to this channel so more stories like this can reach hearts across the world. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a moment of truth, and you were part of it.